Imagine a trip meant to bring joy, rest, and family memories. Instead, it delivers a haunting experience that shakes you to your core. Tonight, we'll dive into the first-hand account of a terrifying event that unfolded in the isolated hills of a rural town. This isn't fiction, it's a real story of fear, confusion, and an encounter with something beyond our understanding. But before we delve into the eerie details, I have one question. Do you believe in ghosts? If so, you might want to keep the lights on. If not, this story might just change your mind. It began innocently enough. A family's visit to an old country house to spend time with their aging grandfather. After a grueling journey by bus, they arrived, exhausted but eager to settle in. The house was simple yet unnervingly quiet, its silence punctuated only by the occasional groan of its old wooden beams. The air inside felt heavy, colder than expected, as if the house itself was watching them. No one thought much of it, yet. The protagonist, worn out from the trip, barely noticed the strange sensation creeping into their chest as they picked a room with two doors, one leading to the living room and the other to their mother's room. The house's isolation was both its charm and its curse. Nestled on a quiet hill, surrounded by dark woods, it seemed frozen in time. But as the sun set and shadows deepened, the charm gave way to unease. The kind that makes you look over your shoulder and question whether you're truly alone. The family had no idea they were stepping into a story far older and far darker than themselves. A story that would begin to reveal itself in the dead of night. Before we continue, a word of caution. This is not your ordinary ghost story. This is a real account of what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. So if you're ready to face the unknown, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And remember, some truths are more terrifying than any fiction. As the sun sank behind the hills, the house seemed to awaken. Its creaking wooden floors and groaning walls echoed faintly, like whispers in a language no one could understand. The family had arrived earlier that evening, their bus journey leaving them tired and eager for rest. The house, perched on the edge of a dense forest, stood alone, surrounded by nothing but tall trees and the faint rustle of leaves. From the outside, it looked like any ordinary countryside home, modest, with chipped paint and a tiled roof worn by time. But stepping inside was like entering another world. The air was cold, unnaturally so. It clung to the skin like an invisible mist, heavy and oppressive. The faint smell of damp would mixed with something more subtle, something metallic that no one could quite place. The protagonist noticed it immediately but brushed it off, assuming the chill was just the mountain air. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, their subjects staring blankly into the room, eyes lifeless, as if the years had drained them of their humanity. The furniture was old, mismatched, and eerily arranged, as though someone had tried to recreate a sense of order in a space that defied it. The room the protagonist chose for the night was peculiar. Two doors stood at opposite ends, one leading to the dimly lit living room and the other to their mother's room. The bed was tucked into a corner, its frame sturdy but cold to the touch. A small window offered a view of the sprawling forest, where shadows seemed to shift unnaturally under the pale moonlight. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as though the house itself had eyes that followed their every move. As they unpacked their belongings, the sounds of the house grew louder, creaks, groans, and faint thuds, as if something unseen was moving within the walls. The protagonist tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the quirks of an old home. But as the family gathered for dinner, the unease only deepened. The dim lighting cast long, flickering shadows across the room, giving the impression that someone, or something, was lurking just beyond the edge of vision. The grandfather, though welcoming, seemed distracted, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as though he were expecting someone to appear. He spoke little during the meal, his silence adding to the tension. The protagonist noticed how he hesitated before answering simple questions, his responses vague and distant. At one point, he glanced toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms and muttered something under his breath. It was too faint to hear, but the look on his face was unmistakable fear. That night, as the family prepared for bed, the protagonist couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The shadows in the corners of their room seemed darker, heavier, as if they were pooling together, waiting for the lights to go out. The doors, though closed, felt insubstantial, as though whatever was outside could pass through them without effort. The forest beyond the window was silent, unnaturally still, amplifying the soft creaks and groans of the house. As the protagonist lay down, pulling the covers tight against the cold, they whispered a silent hope, that sleep would come quickly and shield them from the growing sense of dread. But deep down they knew, this house wasn't just old. It was alive, and it had been waiting for them. The first night began innocently enough. The exhaustion from the long bus ride weighed heavily on everyone, making it easy to fall into a restless sleep despite the eerie atmosphere of the house. The protagonist, cocooned under layers of blankets to fend off the biting cold, drifted off while the faint creaks of the wooden floorboards echoed in the background. At first, these noises were easy to dismiss, just the sounds of an old house settling into the chill of the night. But as the hours crept by, the silence grew sharper, cutting through the darkness like a blade. It began with a touch, gentle, almost hesitant. The kind of nudge that one might expect from a loved one trying to wake you. Half asleep, the protagonist stirred, assuming it was their mother checking if they were warm enough in the unfamiliar cold. But when their eyes cracked open, they saw her lying in her bed, sound asleep, her figure unmoving in the faint light spilling through the curtains. Confusion gave way to unease as the realization dawned. Whoever, or whatever, had touched them was still standing beside their bed. Through the corner of their eye, they caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow taller than it should have been. Turning their heads slowly, their breath caught in their throat. A woman was standing there, her silhouette stark against the pale moonlight filtering through the window. She was tall and impossibly thin, her long, dark hair cascading over the shoulders of a stark white dress. Her head tilted ever so slightly, as if she were observing the protagonist with quiet intensity. Frozen in place, the protagonist's heart thundered in their chest, each beat reverberating like a drum. They tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, a lingering dream. But the air had changed. It was thick, oppressive, and carried a faint, metallic tang. The woman did not move, did not blink. She simply stood there, as though waiting for something, or someone. The room felt colder now, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones and makes your breath visible, even in the dim light. Summoning every ounce of courage, the protagonist sat up, their eyes fixed on the figure. But the moment they moved, she was gone. No sound, no lingering shadow. The room was empty. Both doors remained tightly shut, their latches still secure. It was as though she had never been there at all. Shaking, the protagonist lay back down, their mind racing with possibilities. Was it exhaustion playing tricks on them? A dream so vivid it felt real? Or was it something more? Clinging to the hope that sleep would erase the memory, they pulled the blankets over their head and whispered to themselves, "If it's important, they'll wake me again." The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the air of the house seemed to shift. When dawn broke, the protagonist noticed faint scratches near the doorframe, marks that hadn't been there before. As the family stirred and the sounds of mourning filled the house, the protagonist resolved to stay silent about what had happened. After all, who would believe them? But deep down they knew, the woman in white wasn't a dream. She was real, and she wasn't done yet. The following day began with an uneasy normalcy. The house was alive with the morning routines of breakfast and chatter, but beneath the surface, something felt off. The protagonist couldn't stop thinking about the figure they had seen the night before. The image of the tall woman in white, her dark hair framing a face that they couldn't quite make out, lingered like a smudge in their mind. They wanted to tell someone, maybe their mother or even their grandfather, but fear of sounding irrational kept them silent. After all, what could they say? That they'd seen a ghost? Even as they tried to dismiss it, the memory gnawed at them, refusing to fade. The house itself seemed to change as the day wore on. Its walls felt closer, its shadows darker. The creaks in the floorboards sounded deliberate, as if someone, or something, was moving just out of sight. Each noise made the protagonist's pulse quicken, their eyes darting toward the source, only to find nothing there. Yet, an undeniable feeling of being watched followed them wherever they went. The sensation was strongest in their room, where the scratches near the doorframe seemed deeper in the daylight, as if they'd been made by something sharp and determined. That night, as the family prepared for bed, the protagonist wrestled with an inner conflict. A part of them desperately wanted to lock their door, bury themselves under the blankets, and pray for the night to pass uneventfully. But another part, the part fueled by curiosity and a need for answers, urged them to stay alert, to confront whatever might come. The scratches, the shadowy figure, the oppressive chill in the air, none of it made sense. And yet, it felt like the house itself was trying to communicate, to force them to see something. Sleep came reluctantly, the weight of anticipation heavier than any blanket. Hours passed in restless silence, the cold seeping into the room once more. The protagonist's heart pounded in their chest as they lay staring at the ceiling, their ears straining for the slightest sound. Then, just as the night before, it began again, a faint creaking, like footsteps moving across the floor. But this time, the sound wasn't just outside their room. It was inside. Frozen in place, they held their breath, their body rigid with fear. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, and stopped just beside their bed. They wanted to turn their head, to see who, or what, was there, but terror kept them still. The air grew impossibly cold, and the faint metallic smell from the previous night returned, stronger now, sharp enough to make their stomach churn. Summoning every ounce of courage, the protagonist turned their head ever so slowly. Nothing. The room was empty. And yet, the sensation of someone standing there was so palpable, it was suffocating. They could feel eyes on them, though no one was in sight. Desperate for answers, they sat up abruptly, their hands trembling as they reached for the lamp beside the bed. The light flickered on, casting long shadows across the room, but still nothing. The protagonist had a choice to make. They could ignore the strange events, pretend none of it was real, and endure the rest of the week in terrified denial. Or they could investigate. A glance at the scratches on the doorframe, now appearing fresher than ever, sealed their decision. They needed to know. Whatever was haunting this house, whatever was trying to make itself known, wasn't going to stop until it was acknowledged. Swallowing their fear, they resolved to face the unknown, no matter how horrifying the truth might be. The third night descended with an unnatural stillness. The air inside the house was colder than ever, and even the usual creaks and groans of the wooden structure seemed to have quieted, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The protagonist lay in bed, wide awake, every muscle tense with anticipation. They had decided to confront whatever was haunting them, but as the clock ticked closer to midnight, doubt began to creep in. What if they weren't ready? What if it was something far worse than they imagined? Then it began. At first, it was subtle, a faint sound like the rustling of fabric. The protagonist sat up, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, more distinct, like someone dragging a heavy gown across the floor. It came from the corner of the room, the darkest spot where the faint moonlight didn't reach. The protagonist's heart pounded in their chest, their breath shallow and quick. They squinted into the darkness, their eyes struggling to adjust. And then they saw her. The woman in white was back, but this time, she wasn't standing idly by the bed. She was crouched in the corner, her dark hair falling in messy waves over her face. Her dress, once pristine, was now tattered, its edges frayed and damp as if soaked in something unidentifiable. Her head tilted slightly upward, and though her face was obscured, the protagonist could feel her gaze piercing through them like icy needles. The metallic scent that had lingered the nights before now filled the room, sharp and suffocating. It was unmistakable, the smell of blood. The protagonist wanted to scream, to run, but their body refused to move. The woman began to rise slowly, her movements unnaturally fluid, almost as if she were floating. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on the protagonist like an invisible weight. Suddenly, the sound of a door creaking broke the oppressive silence. The door connecting to the living room swung open slowly, though no one was there. The woman paused, her head snapping toward the sound with a jerky, unnatural motion. Then she turned back to the protagonist, as if deciding whether to stay or follow whatever had caught her attention. For a moment, the protagonist thought she might leave, that the nightmare might end. But then she took a step forward. The protagonist's instincts kicked in. They lunged for the lamp, hoping to flood the room with light. But as their hand reached the switch, the bulb shattered, plunging the room into total darkness. The sound of the glass breaking was deafening, and for a few agonizing seconds, all they could hear was their own ragged breathing. Then came the whisper. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, clearer. It was a woman's voice, low and cold, speaking in a language the protagonist didn't recognize. The words were sharp and guttural, each syllable cutting through the silence like a blade. The voice seemed to echo from every corner of the room, surrounding the protagonist in a cacophony of sound. Desperate, they grabbed their phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, landing on the corner where the woman had been. She was gone. The door to the living room was now wide open, and the faint outline of footprints, wet, smeared, and dark, led out into the hallway. Shaking, the protagonist followed the trail, their flashlight trembling in their hand. The footprints stopped abruptly in front of the grandfather's room. The door was ajar, creaking slightly as though it had been left open in a hurry. Taking a deep breath, they pushed it open wider, the beam of light cutting through the oppressive darkness. Inside, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the air oddly warm compared to the rest of the house. But as they turned to leave, something caught their eye, a single white handprint smudged onto the wooden headboard. It was small, delicate, and dripping with a dark, red liquid that was unmistakable. The protagonist backed out of the room, their mind racing. They didn't know what was happening or why, but one thing was certain. Whatever haunted this house wasn't confined to their room. It was everywhere, and it wasn't going to stop. The air in the house was thick with dread as the protagonist retreated from their grandfather's room, their flashlight flickering ominously. The white handprint, smeared with a red liquid that could only be blood, was burned into their mind. They stumbled back into the hallway, the faint metallic scent now overwhelming, making it hard to breathe. The house was silent, eerily so, as if the very walls were listening, waiting for something to happen. The footprints had vanished, leaving no trace of where the woman in white had gone. But deep down, the protagonist knew they weren't alone. The realization hit like a cold wave. The scratches on the doorframe, the broken lamp, the whispers in the dark. This wasn't a series of random events. The house was alive, and it had been watching them since the moment they arrived. Driven by a mix of terror and a desperate need for answers, the protagonist made their way to the living room. The old, faded photographs on the walls seemed to stare at them, their lifeless eyes now almost accusatory. Each step echoed unnaturally loud, as though the house were amplifying their movements, mocking their fear. Their grandfather's cryptic behavior from earlier in the week suddenly made sense. He knew something. He had to. Gathering every ounce of courage, the protagonist decided to search for clues. There was a small cabinet tucked into the corner of the living room, its wood warped and discolored by time. It looked out of place, almost hidden, as if it had been deliberately placed there to be forgotten. With trembling hands, they opened it, the old hinges groaning in protest. Inside, they found a collection of tattered papers and a small, leather-bound journal. The journal's cover was embossed with initials that the protagonist didn't recognize. Flipping through its brittle pages, they were struck by a series of entries, written in shaky handwriting. The entries described a woman, tall, with dark hair and a flowing white dress, who had once lived in the house. She was described as kind, almost angelic, but the later entries grew darker, hinting at a tragic story. The last pages revealed the horrifying truth. The woman had died in the house under mysterious circumstances, her body discovered in the very room where the protagonist had been sleeping. The words on the final page were scrawled hastily, as though written in a fit of panic. She doesn't rest. She watches. She waits. She takes what belongs to her. The flashlight flickered again, plunging the room into near darkness. For a brief moment, the protagonist thought they saw movement in the reflection of the old, dusty mirror hanging above the cabinet. A shadow, impossibly tall, seemed to shift behind them. They turned sharply, but the room was empty. Or so it seemed. And then it happened. A soft, cold hand grazed the back of their neck, sending an icy jolt through their body. Whipping around, the flashlight now steady, they found themselves face to face with her. The woman in white stood mere inches away, her dark hair obscuring most of her face. What little they could see was unnerving. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, like two embers about to extinguish. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the room filled with the same guttural whispers the protagonist had heard the night before. The words were incomprehensible, yet they seemed to vibrate through the walls, the floor, and even their own chest. The protagonist wanted to run, but their feet felt glued to the floor. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they coalesced into a single chilling sentence. "You are not welcome here." In a desperate bid for escape, the protagonist raised the journal, almost instinctively, as if it could shield them. The woman recoiled slightly, her form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The room was empty again, but the cold remained, seeping into every corner of the house. The protagonists stood frozen, the journal still clutched tightly in their hands. They knew the truth now. The woman in white wasn't just a ghost. She was a guardian of the house, tied to it by tragedy and rage. She had been trying to protect something, or someone, and the family's arrival had disturbed whatever fragile balance she had maintained. The house was her domain, and anyone who stayed too long risked becoming part of its dark history. The morning after the encounter, the house felt different. The oppressive silence that had cloaked it for days seemed to have lifted, but the atmosphere remained heavy, like the stillness before a storm. The protagonist hadn't slept. Their mind replayed the night's events in an endless loop. The image of the woman in white, her glowing eyes and cold presence, was burned into their memory. They knew the encounter wasn't a nightmare, it was a warning. But the real question lingered, a warning about what? As the family gathered for breakfast, the protagonist noticed their grandfather's usual distracted demeanor had worsened. He sat quietly at the table, his gaze fixed on the window as though expecting something, or someone, to appear. The protagonist decided to confront him, the leather-bound journal clutched tightly in their hands. The moment they placed it on the table, their grandfather's face went pale, and his hands began to tremble. "Where did you find that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "In the cabinet," the protagonist replied. "Who is she? Why is she still here?" The old man sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping under the weight of an unspoken truth. He hesitated, glancing at the journal as though it were a cursed artifact. Finally, he began to speak. He told them about a woman named Maria, who had once been the housekeeper when he was a boy. Maria was kind and gentle, but her life had ended tragically. Rumors swirled about how she died. Some said it was an accident, others whispered about a betrayal that led her to despair. Whatever the truth, her death had left a stain on the house, one that never faded. "She's not at rest," the grandfather said, his voice shaking. "This house belongs to her now. She protects it. She protects me. But she doesn't like strangers." The weight of his words settled over the family like a dark cloud. The protagonist finally understood the meaning behind the whispers, the scratches on the door, and the chilling encounters. The woman in white wasn't just a ghost. She was a presence bound to the house, driven by a mixture of sorrow and anger. She wasn't there to harm them, but her warnings were clear. The family didn't belong there. Despite the unease, the family decided to stay one more night, convinced they could leave peacefully in the morning. But the house had other plans. As the sun set, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors opened and closed on their own, faint whispers filled the air, and shadows flickered in places where no one stood. It was as if the house itself was trying to expel them. That night, the protagonist lay in bed, clutching the journal tightly, hoping it might offer some protection. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, colder than it had ever been. Then came the footsteps, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. They stopped just outside the door. For a moment, all was silent, and then the handle began to turn. The protagonist's heart pounded as the door creaked open, revealing the woman in white standing in the doorway. Her form seemed more solid now, her eyes burning with an unnatural light. She didn't move, but the message was clear. This was their final warning. Summoning every ounce of courage, the protagonist stood, holding the journal out toward her. "We're leaving in the morning," they said, their voice trembling. "We won't disturb you anymore." For a moment, the woman remained still, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she raised her hand and pointed toward the window. The protagonist turned to look and saw a faint light flickering in the distance, deep within the woods. When they turned back, the woman was gone, and the door was closed. The family left at dawn, the house receding into the mist as they drove away. No one spoke during the journey, the weight of their experience too heavy to put into words. But the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in white was still watching, her presence lingering like a shadow in the corners of their mind. Weeks later, the protagonist received a call from their grandfather's neighbor. The old man had left the house, saying he couldn't live there anymore. He had locked the doors and boarded up the windows, vowing never to return. The house stood empty, but the stories persisted, of whispers in the night, shadows moving through the halls, and the woman in white, still waiting for the next intruder who dared to enter her domain. Even after leaving the house, the protagonist couldn't escape its grip. The chilling events replayed in their mind like a sinister melody they couldn't silence. At first, they chalked it up to lingering fear, the way traumatic memories sometimes cling to the edges of our thoughts. But as days turned into weeks, they realized this was something far darker. The woman in white wasn't just tied to the house, she had left her mark on them. It started subtly, almost innocuously. The protagonist would wake in the middle of the night with a sense of déjà vu, the cold air of the countryside seemingly invading their room despite the city's warmth. They began noticing strange occurrences, the faint smell of metal lingering in their home, shadows that didn't align with any objects, and the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps when no one else was around. These were small things, easy to dismiss. But then came the dreams. Each night, they dreamed of the house, its dark halls stretching endlessly, the creaking floors louder and more menacing than before. In these dreams, the woman in white appeared again, always at a distance, watching silently. Her presence was no longer confined to the house. She seemed to follow them through the dreamscape, her glowing eyes piercing the darkness. No matter how fast they ran or where they hid, she was always there, waiting just beyond the edge of their vision. One night, the dreams took a darker turn. The protagonist found themselves back in their room at the house, clutching the leather-bound journal. The air was icy, and the familiar metallic scent filled their nostrils. The woman in white stood at the foot of the bed, closer than ever before. Her face, previously obscured, was now fully visible. Her hollow eyes and sunken cheeks painted a picture of agony and rage. She didn't speak, but her presence radiated an undeniable message: "You cannot forget me. I will not let you." The protagonist woke in a cold sweat, their chest heaving as though they'd been running for hours. The room was dark and silent, but something felt wrong. Turning on the light, they noticed faint scratches on their bedroom door, scratches that hadn't been there before. Panic surged through them as they realized the haunting had followed them home. The woman in white wasn't bound to the house as they had believed. She was bound to them. Desperate for answers, the protagonist reached out to their grandfather. He had moved into a small apartment far from the countryside, abandoning the house completely. When they told him about the dreams and the strange occurrences, his voice grew grave. "She's not done with you," he said. "Once she marks you, you carry her with you. You disturbed her peace. Now she's a part of your story." The realization hit like a thunderclap. The woman in white was more than a ghost. She was a reminder, a lingering fragment of a life cut short, seeking justice or vengeance, perhaps both. The protagonist tried everything to rid themselves of her presence, cleansing rituals, prayers, even therapy to rationalize the experience. But nothing worked. Each night, the dreams returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. The woman was relentless, her whispers growing louder, more insistent. The final straw came one night when the protagonist woke to find the journal lying on their bedside table. They hadn't brought it home. It had been left behind at the house. Yet there it was, its leather cover cracked and worn. The same ominous words etched into its final page: "She doesn't rest. She watches. She waits. She takes what belongs to her." The protagonists stared at the journal, their hands trembling. The metallic scent filled the room once more, and the temperature plummeted. Then, faintly at first but growing louder, came the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. They turned toward the door, their heart pounding in their chest, and saw it slowly creak open. Standing in the doorway was the woman in white, her dark hair framing her pale, hollow face. She took a step forward, her glowing eyes locking onto theirs. The light in the room flickered and went out, plunging everything into darkness. The protagonist felt a cold hand brush against their shoulder, followed by a whisper that sent chills down their spine. "You'll never escape me." To this day, the protagonist lives with the haunting. The woman in white remains a shadow in their life, a constant reminder of the house and the secrets it holds. They have moved several times, tried to start fresh in new cities, but she always finds them. She is their burden, their curse, and their silent companion in the dark. And now, as you listen to this story, you might feel a chill in the air or hear a faint creak in the floorboards. Perhaps she's already watching you too. If you've ever experienced something similar, share your story in the comments. And remember, some doors once opened can never be closed.